Many use the internet considering it more like a walk in a park rather than realizing it's more like a trip down a dark alley. Today's guest is Stuart Madnick. Professor Madnick has been a faculty member at MIT since 1972. He has served as the head of MIT's IT group for more than 20 years. During that time, the group has consistently rated #1 in the nation among business school information technology programs. Dr. Madnick is a prolific writer and author or co-author of over 380 books, articles, or technical reports and textbooks. He has a degree in electronic engineering, management, and computer science from MIT. He has been a visiting professor scholar at Harvard University and 6 additional countries. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey Podcast. Stuart Madnick, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey Podcast today.
Thank you. I'm glad to join you.
So can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do? And you have probably been involved in cybersecurity in one way or another, probably longer than most of the listeners have been alive. So this is going to be a great conversation.
Well, first thing, I am Stuart Madnick. I am the John Norris McGuire Professor of Information Technologies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. I also have an appointment as a professor of engineering systems in the MIT School of Engineering. But most relevant to our conversation today, I am the founding director of cybersecurity at MIT Sloan, that was formerly known as the Consortium for Improving Interdisciplinary Consumer. I can't remember it anymore, which is part of the reason why we changed the name. But getting back to your point, I've been involved in cybersecurity since at least, I think, 1974. I wrote several papers back then, and in 1979 co-authored a book called Computer Security. So I've been involved in cybersecurity issues pretty much for a long time, although I've been involved in other things as well.
There's a wealth of stuff that I see us diving into. At what point did you start seeing, cybersecurity as more than just an individual computer threat?
Well, as you may know, I can't remember what year it was. There's the famous Morris worm. I don't remember what year it was, but it probably was maybe late 1980s and so on, which basically shut down a significant portion of the internet. And various things like that, although in some cases they were not deliberate or they were not intended to cause great harm. Often they were experiments that went wild. That's when it became clear that the internet, which is a great wonder for many of us, allows things to happen that we could never envision before. In fact, it turns out there are examples of cybersecurity events predating the internet.
Oh, wow.
Back in the era when people would exchange floppy disks and so on. And so there actually were examples of that. I don't remember the dates of those, but that's probably back in the early 1970s and so on.
I do remember a couple of those types of things back from the days when me and my friends would meet together and exchange copies of games and things like that. And you always had to be worried that you might bring something nasty home with you. Exactly.
So it's been around. I guess the key thing is, when did it get to be the attention of the average person in public?
Yeah.
And I think that's clearly post-internet, when everybody started connecting their computers and all of a sudden discovering all kind of fun things were happening to their computers.
Yeah. I think the first significant large-scale, event is maybe not the right word, was I think the Melissa virus.
Yeah.
Was probably mid to late 90s or something like that. And everybody at the company I was working for was getting dozens of copies of this virus all day long, every day.
And then, of course, the back in around 1999, 2000, just before the dot-com crash, there was a dot-com boom.
Yep. And
basically everything was dot-comming, and which means everybody was getting on the internet. And, of course, all kinds of fun things started happening.
Yeah. And it's some of this, the reason why this is even an issue is that, like, in my perception, the internet was never really designed with security in mind. It was always this, we're a bunch of educators, we trust each other. Why would we, trust was just implicit in the process.
Well, there's several aspects of that, because I although I agree with everything you just said, I think a lot of the things that have happened since then are not based upon that. But I think the two things that are true is, I think people are very trusting of the internet. Mm-hmm. It's like a cuddly, teddy bear, if you will. So to that extent, a lot of people, going down a dark alley at night probably makes people cautious.
Yeah.
But connecting onto the internet doesn't have that same scary feel about it. But the real problem we have is, I think, by and large, and that's why I'm glad to chat with you and your audience, is so many people are not aware that it is a dark alley and what things to be warned about. And so I think we need to do a much better effort of that. One of the examples I often use, and I don't know how many decades this took, but industrial settings, manufacturers and so on, understand the idea of safety. And the example I use, if you were to go into a modern plant nowadays, you'll typically see a sign over the door that says 550 days since last industrial accident.
Yeah.
P.S. Please don't be the one who set it back to zero. But when's the last time we went to a data center and saw a sign that said 50 milliseconds since last cyber attack? I mean, in manufacturing and so on, safety is something you hear about, talk about, worry about every single day. Cybersecurity is way nowhere near that.
Yeah.
And that's a big concern.
I mean, it's almost, in some sense, the cybersecurity risks are almost ubiquitous. Like, if you turn on a device that's public internet facing with no firewall, stuff just starts trying to connect to you without you initiating any contact. You just start getting scanned immediately.
And one of the things is, you may be familiar with the term Internet of Things, IoT, where almost everything has a computer in it.
Yeah.
And actually, ironically, I actually picked up a smart toothbrush with a computer in it. You may know about that. It'll actually send messages to your smartphone, giving you a kind of a status update on how good a job you're doing brushing your teeth. I used to joke, everything will have a computer in it except for a brick. And someone showed me an article about smart bricks.
Oh, gee.
So the question is, they're all over the place. They're spreading like weeds. And unfortunately, as you said before, not only was the internet not designed with security in mind, probably my toothbrush wasn't either.
And I mean, is that where we're starting to see problems with? I mean, before we started recording, we were talking about internet-connected refrigerators. It sounds like a great idea, but who's the expert who comes and maintains your smart refrigerator?
Yeah, and of course there have been examples of attacks on smart televisions. Basically every device that's on the internet is a candidate, and particularly the newer devices. The newer they are, the less likely people thought about security in them. I mean, who worries about the security of your toothbrush?
Yeah, not I. Now I'm starting to wonder, is my toothbrush internet connected? I sure hope it isn't. So what are kind of the failures you see both on let's start consumer first and then on corporate, where you kind of see those consumer and corporate weaknesses of where we're not doing what we need to be doing?
Well, there's a limited number of things that we as individuals can do, because a lot of times these vulnerabilities come about through services you use. So we'll come back to that side on the corporate side later on. And there's many things that we can do that most of us are somewhat aware of, but not completely. The classic case, if you get an email saying, "Hello, I am a Nigerian prince. I want to give you a lot of money. Please do the following things." Believe it or not, I was told still 1 to 3% fall for that.
Oh, I actually, unfortunately, believe you.
Well, in fact, I was told an interesting story. I said, well, usually it's poorly worded. The English is terrible. They said, no, you don't understand, Madnick. This is an IQ test. What they're trying to do, it's going to take time to get you to get the money out. So they want to make sure they've got someone who's really gullible and ain't too bright. And so they deliberately make it sloppy so that you and I presumably would push it off to the side. And that 1 to 3% who go that next step, they know, I've got a good chance of landing. So ironically, some of the really bad ones are deliberately bad.
That's actually kind of inspiring and discouraging at the same time. And I think, to me, like a lot of the ones that I see, yesterday, in fact, was, I got this notice from DHL that my package was delivered to the wrong address. And since maybe it was Amazon or something like that. But since during COVID, everything's e-commerce, everyone just assumes, that must be my package. Let me click on that link. Exactly.
But one thing, I'm not sure the term is familiar to all of your listeners and such, but the term spear phishing is kind of the flip side of that. And so rather than they'd be, either the Nigerian prince or maybe a little bit closer to home, Amazon delivery, which is something you might be expecting. But spear phishing is when they actually bother to do either A, rely upon your public information, things that you have on your Facebook page or whatever, or B, they may have actually gotten into your computer and actually reading all of your correspondence. And based upon that, they craft something. The typical case that you hear about goes as follows. It's typically allegedly an email from the CEO of the company to the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, saying something like, well, we're negotiating a merger deal with this company in Indonesia, which is something that they do. The company does things like that. And there's a law firm over there that we need to send a retainer to, send $200,000 to the following account in Indonesia.
Yep.
And the email, though, usually starts off with saying, hello there, Chris. It was great to get together with your wife for dinner last Wednesday. We've got to do that again. And now, please, blah, blah. Yeah. And let's say you did have dinner with him last Wednesday. So it just is so obviously, this is your boss talking to you, and he asked you to do that. But ironically enough, although many of them are looking for hundreds of thousands of dollars, apparently there are parts of the world where $200 is a decent week's pay. And I know at least of one university where half a dozen people in a department were hit with a message allegedly from the department chair saying, my nephew's having a birthday party tonight. I'm in meetings all day long. Could you please stop by the local CVS or whatever and pick up a $100 gift card from me and just email me the number on the back of the card? And a half a dozen fell for it. So, basically, you've got to be alert. You've got to be cautious.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's when I get the email saying, "Hey, I've got $10 million. I'm trying to figure out a good, reliable humanitarian to give the money to." It's like, okay, come on, $10 million. But I think that because that's one of those things that in our minds is a red flag. Millions of dollars. Oh, it has to be fraudulent. But in your situation, you're talking about a few $100 here or there. Someone, it's not outside the realm of a normal conversation.
Well, the spear phishing ones are ones that are so realistic and so plausible. You fall for them. I'll give you an extreme example. You might appreciate it because it was someone like you, Chris, for example, was some kind of investigative reporter was talking to a firm that basically aids companies. And they were talking about spear phishing. So they said at the end of the meeting, they said, tell you what we're going to do, Chris. Between now and next week, you will be a victim of spear phishing. We will pick you as a target. Let's talk next week. And of course, during the week, various things came by that he realized were kind of fishy, and he kind of discarded them. But before the week is out, he had fallen for at least one of them. And remember, he's someone who kind of is somewhat aware of this stuff, and he had been told ahead of time. And so don't feel bad if you get hit by it. Better people than us have been hit successfully.
Well, and I think that's important to communicate to people. It's not, we were kind of tongue in cheek saying that the Nigerian scammers are targeting people that are, low IQ, or people who, if they're not going to notice the grammar mistakes, we're going to weed them out. But it's even, there are scams that target the best and the brightest of us. And I think it's that mentality of, as soon as we think that we're doing everything right and we're perfectly secure and we have all of our systems in place is the point that we need to start truly worrying about whether or not we're going to fall victim, because I think we become overly reliant on, well, I wouldn't fall for that because I know better.
Yeah, exactly. But while we're still talking about kind of the typical consumer, if you will, there's one thing I often stress very much, besides all the cautions we've talked about and many more of them. I often say, well, consider the possibility, no matter how cautious you are, you fall for something. How do you minimize the damage? And this is something most people don't think about, whether the minimizing damage is if they get into your computer and they steal all your data or corrupt all your data. And so things, simple, I call hygiene issues, but how recent did you back up your data? There's a lot of, you should, it's a little bit like why you buy your fire insurance. You don't want to have a fire in your house, but you have to be prepared. You probably have a fire extinguisher in your house, probably also. In the same way, we do some things to realize that a bad thing can happen, but what can we do to minimize the damage? That's a line of thinking that surprisingly few people even are starting to think about.
Yeah, I have to admit there are. I'm one of those people that at times am overly cautious about such things.
Mhm.
Like if we're talking backups, I have a network attached backup. I rotate through a physical backup that I take to my local bank and swap out a drive in there, and then I also have an online backup because I'm thinking, well, if someone breaks into the house, they're going to get the physical one and the NAS, so there
Yeah,
better be the house burns down.
yeah,
It's
exactly,
multiple
exactly.
places, multiple copies.
Well, you get a double A rating. I'm going to tell you, unfortunately, I suspect the number of people like you are, unfortunately, a small percentage.
But it takes conscious effort to maintain it. Truly, I do like a lot of the online backup solutions because
Yeah.
it doesn't require someone to, let me pop a drive in, let me hit the button that says backup, and that automation hopefully removes a lot of operator inconvenience. I like that idea of minimizing damage. I think of that way with my finances as well. Is we have a primary bank account where my wife and I do our banking. We deposit our paychecks and things like that. But I have a second bank account that is it's not connected to any other bank accounts. It's never wired money to or from any other bank accounts. That I have enough money in that I can survive a couple months if someone gets into my regular bank account.
Mhm.
And while I know most people can't do that, I know a lot of people that are, 7-figure earners that hasn't even crossed their mind to have a second bank account unless they're trying to hide it from their girlfriend or something like that.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I guess the key thing here when you talk about individuals is you need to think about kind of what your backup, not just disk backup or data backup, but what is, if something bad happens via your computer, whether it be your bank account or whatever it is, what is your plan? Unfortunately, that's the joke I use is most people don't realize their batteries and their flashlight are out until electricity is turned off. That's not the right time to find out your batteries don't work.
And that is unfortunately that's the case. Anecdotally, a lot of small businesses that do have automated on-site backups have never actually tried to restore from the backup. And I know one company that the system went down and they need to do the backup, and the instructions on how to do the backup were on the computer that died. And so they're like, well, we don't have the password because it was on that computer.
Yeah.
And so they'd never actually tried to restore their data. And so effectively, if you've never tested your backup, I'm not sure that you really do have a backup in case like
So,
your
there's
flashlight
many
batteries.
things. There's probably a long laundry list, but I think it's more a way of thinking.
Yeah.
Imagine that something has happened. What is your contingency? How do you back things up? But I do want to talk a little bit on the corporate side, unless you want to go any further on the consumer side.
Let's go corporate.
Well, this part, once again, is probably not something that the average listener is going to be able to deal with directly, but it is a matter of understanding. There used to be a radio show, maybe still going on, called The Rest of the Story. You remember that?
I believe so.
And the idea being is you see the headline, but usually there's much more than the headline. Well, the same thing is true in cybersecurity for lots of reasons. A, because people like to make the story as simple as possible, but also B, most companies want to minimize the damage to their reputation and so on. So you'll hear stories like, well, we had a cyber attack because someone forgot to update the software, or we had a cyber attack because someone misconfigured this firewall. But these are actual headlines, by the way, more or less. I'm not reading them, but roughly speaking, the headlines. And the impression that comes across was some individual, a little sloppy one day, wasn't paying attention, made a minor mistake, problem solved, guy may be fired for all we know, nothing more to worry about. We've been researching about a half a dozen of these cases in depth. We've sometimes gone through over 50,000 pages, not every single page, but of testimony and court documents and so on. And almost always a major cyber attack, one that steals lots of money or typically steal hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's, social security numbers and so on. Almost all of those things cannot be done with just a single mistake. Mm-hmm. The classic case is, someone breaks in the front door, but they still got to find a way to unbolt the safe from the floor.
Yeah.
Or they got to find a way to get into the safe. And there's lots of things that they have to do. And in one case, we wrote an article that appeared in MIS Executive magazine about the Equifax, which is 108, for the actual number, 100 million or so people, social security numbers, addresses, shoe sizes probably, were all stolen. And we identified what I call 18 management indecisions, or I call them semi-conscious decisions. And what I mean by a semi-conscious decision is someone said, well, gee whiz, the front door is wide open. Should we do something about it? And he said, well, no, the weather's nice outside. Just leave the front door open. Without pausing, but that we're in a neighborhood where burglars take place.
Yeah.
In other words, they made the half a decision without stopping for a second to say, but what is the possible consequence of that decision?
So what were some of the 18 things that Equifax should have done, that, or the quasi decisions that they made, which ultimately resulted in hundreds of millions of records?
Okay. Well, once again, I recommend you read the whole paper because I can't memorize all of it, but I'll give you a few of the examples. One of them is fascinating because they actually had a piece of hardware and software called a intrusion detection system. And basically what it did, it monitored the traffic, internet traffic going in and out of their network to see if anything odd was going on. Mm-hmm. The problem was, in order to monitor that traffic, it needed to have security certificates, which had expired 9 months earlier. So basically, it was a brick sitting there doing nothing for 9 months. Now, that's one instance, but and of course, during that 9 months is when, in fact, when they actually, for whatever reason, finally fixed the certificate, that's when the alarms went off 9 months later that something was going on. But what's interesting about it was not just that 9 months went on with anybody noticing this brick was sitting there, is apparently this issue had come up earlier because, as you may know, in your systems, we have certificates all over the place for all kinds of permissions, if you will. And someone had pointed out the fact that they had thousands of certificates at a big company like Equifax, but maintaining those certificates and keeping them up to date is a manual task.
Yep. And
someone had said, well, this is very time consuming, but also very error prone. We may forget to check on one. And they had recommended that a monitoring system be put together. I don't know how much it would have cost. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it would have taken time and effort that would allow them to kind of centralize it, be able to get an alert. Oh, the certificate over there is not working right. And some management guy said, not that important. That decision cost them $1.7 billion. Yeah. That and a bunch of other decisions. So no one said, well, you realize, of course, you are putting $1.7 billion on the line. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. But by not doing that, this is what could happen. And that's what I mean by semi-conscious decision-making.
Isn't that kind of one of the big challenge? And I think this is starting to change, that IT officials or the IT guys, the security guys in a company have, is that trying to go to management and ask for money so that something doesn't happen. It's hard to get funding. Hey, we want you to spend a whole bunch of money so that something doesn't happen, and you're never going to. If we do it right, you're never going to get your ROI.
Is that? Well, there's so many versions of that. I'll give you one extreme case. I talked to one security executive in the firm, and it turned out that they were about to cut his budget in half. Why? We had no cybersecurity breaks this year. It's only, we said, you realize there were 50,000 attempted attacks that we were able to ward off. They said, and if you cut my budget, maybe more of those 50,000 will actually make their way through. So you're right. One of the problems is you don't appreciate what doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's why you, in some sense, do buy homeowners insurance and so on. But we haven't quite got to that level of thinking process.
I mean, I think a lot of it is, I think we hear that the saying kind of in the terrorism space is law enforcement needs to get it right 100% of the time, and the terrorist only needs to get it right once.
That's what I call the asymmetric warfare aspect of it, exactly.
And it really seems to be that way with cybersecurity as well, as I've got to make sure everything's patched. I've got to make, there's hundreds of things that I have to look at, and if I miss just one of them, or someone finds one that I didn't know about, that's all it takes for them to potentially compromise
But I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to flip it the other way around, if you will. And once again, I'll use the Equifax case because we have a very detailed analysis of it. In order for that attack to be fully successful, as I said, a number of things had to go the attacker's way. In other words, you didn't have to be stupid once; you had to be stupid a dozen times.
Yeah.
Now, I recommend strongly against that.
Yes, I would as well.
So you're right. I mean, maybe you did forget this. Maybe I'll give you another example. As I remember correctly, they had the security group and the IT group as separate divisions. In fact, they actually reported quite separately in the hierarchy. I have no reason to think they didn't get along with each other, but basically they were relatively separate. What you'll read in the headlines would be is that a patch had not been applied. That's the only thing you hear. Yeah. Someone forgot to apply a patch. What trouble was the people who knew about the patch were a different division of the company that apparently didn't tell the division who was responsible for doing the patch. The left hand didn't know what the right hand had to do. And so it wasn't a matter that someone was told to do the patch and they forgot to do it. They were never told because they were not in the loop with that information was passed to. So there are just so many things individually. Each one of these things is a little bit foolish. And to do all that many of them, there's no reason for that. Unfortunately, we've seen this in a half a dozen companies. So it's not like these are the outliers.
Yeah. Do you see that starting to change, so that larger corporations are being a lot more security conscious and that they're giving more attention to more budget, more attention to cybersecurity risks?
Well, it's difficult to do that over a short period of time. To actually, it's like glaciers moving. They kind of move kind of slow. But I have a more ominous way of thinking about it. Two actually ominous ways of thinking about it. The first one is I do say the good guys are getting better, which is your point there. But I also then say the bad guys are getting badder even faster. Mm. And so, yes, maybe people are beginning to get a little bit of a realization of it. Although you said something I want to make sure that everybody thinks about. Whether it's human nature or corporate, whatever you want to call it, increasing your revenue, increasing your profit makes you very excited. Preventing cyber attacks, not so much. And I've seen time after time after time when those things are just made low on the priority. Now, maybe they've gone from the sub-basement to only the first level basement in the building. But unfortunately, they're always way down in the priority in most organizations.
Yeah. And lack of event doesn't make news either. Yeah. Hey, we've gone 20 years without a cybersecurity incident. CNN or Fox is not going to give you headline coverage for that, but you mess it up once and you're going to get lots of coverage.
Exactly. But the second ominous thing I wanted to mention, once again, maybe we're going from the individual to the corporate to the world, and that's cyber war. I had a conversation just this morning. We have Professor Robert Pindyck is an economist at MIT, and he was a speaker at we have our weekly meetings. He researches catastrophes. Now, he researches mainly things like pandemics, climate change, and things like that. Because we were trying to talk to him about, well, if you think about it, cybersecurity could potentially be a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And so we discussed a little bit what a catastrophic cyber event might look like. Now, once again, as he and I both noted, there was a period of time, and I guess in the 1960s and 70s, where a nuclear attack, I won't say it was likely, but definitely, reason why people were building bomb shelters in their basements was because they took it pretty seriously.
Yeah.
We managed to make it through that period so far, knock on wood, without the world coming to an end. So the fact that a catastrophe can happen doesn't mean it will happen, but we're totally unprepared for a cyber catastrophe.
So what would you see as how would you define a cyber catastrophe, and what would the proverbial bomb shelter be?
Okay. Well, firstly, I hope this is not keeping people awake at night unnecessarily, but there's several things about what a cyber catastrophe would be. First thing, you got to understand something. 99%, or whatever you want to call it, of all cyber attacks, I would call it IT, information technology attacks. They steal your data, they lock up your computer, they ask for ransomware, and so on. And in most cases, what you can do, you can wipe your computer clean. Hopefully, you've got your backup tapes working. Yeah. And so it is a annoyance and can take, could take you maybe a week or more in some extreme cases in a corporate network to get things up and running. But it's not a lasting problem in most cases. One of the things we've observed and actually have demonstrated in our own lab here, when you talk about cyber physical devices, they could include your toothbrush, but more typically we're talking about things like generators and things like that. We have shown how to make them explode. Now, you explode a $800,000, $1 million generator. You don't go to the Radio Shack down the street and say, could you please replace my $1 million generator?
Yeah.
We actually had one that wasn't a cyber attack. It was a malfunction attack situation at MIT. Took 3 months to get it up and running again. Now, that's the first issue is that, and they have examples. We have seen cases of power grids going down, of steel mills being destroyed. So it has happened, but they're one-offs, and they don't get a lot of general publicity.
Would like the Stuxnet?
Stuxnet, that's a good. That's
would be a good example of
exactly 1,000 centrifuges were destroyed by getting them into what they call harmonic frequency, and they basically shook themselves to death.
Yeah, so that's an IT. The computer gets compromised, tells the device to do something, and at some point the device physically fails because you can't do what it's trying to do.
And although this is not a cyber incident, to some extent, that's related to the 737 MAX situation. One of the sensors said you're about to go too fast, you got to go down, and the planes crashed. So, I mean, that was not a cyber, but the same kind of event. You send a phony signal to a device, and it goes and does something really bad. And people can die or things can explode. So the first issue, you got to realize things, when that happens, you're talking about an outage, not measured in hours or days, but outage measured in weeks, even longer. But that makes it into a cyber catastrophe or cyber war. You don't attack just one device. I don't know your background, Chris. I'm an engineer by training, and possibly many other people are. And there was a certain liability there, if you will. Liability in terms we were all taught about independent failures. If you're running a power station and you have 8 generators, they're mechanical devices, and over time you know that a device will fail.
Yeah.
But the probability of turbine number 1 and turbine number 2 failing at the same time is really small, and turbine 3, but that's not true of a cyber attack. The cyber attack that attacks turbine 1 will go through 2 through 8 at the same time. And so when I talk to engineers, none of this is rocket science.
Yeah.
They were taught for decades independent failure. That logic doesn't apply to a cyber attack, to a deliberate cyber attack.
Yeah.
So the difference here is not just that the Northeast power failure will go, or not just that the Texas will freeze up, which is what happened with the snowstorm and so on, is that all the power systems across the country go out at the same time. Now, will that happen? I sure hope not. But technically, there's no reason why it could not happen. That's what I mean by a catastrophe.
So, I know we're talking power grids and getting very I don't want to get too into the weeds, but is that where things like, systems need to be air gapped? Like if, turbines 1 through 4 could be connected, but while they're connected, ones 4 through 8 can't be connected. That sort of thought process on the engineering side.
Well, first thing, for the benefit of anybody who hasn't heard that expression, air gap, which exactly what you're saying is the assumption is, well, our equipment is not connected to the internet. There is a gap, air gap between that. I jokingly say to one of my students that I believe a virus made its way to the International Space Station. Talk about an air gap.
Yeah.
So and Stuxnet also was, quote, air gapped, if you will. So number one, there are ways to get beyond the air gap. Many, which is just simple thing. What you do is you sprinkle little USB memory sticks in the driveway with a sign that says, naked photos on here.
Yeah.
And rely upon someone picking one up in the parking lot, bringing it in, plugging it into his computer in the plant. I mean, there are all kinds of ways, not trivial ways. The reason I say that, though, and this back to your point again, unfortunately, I fear that many of the executives in such power plants and such think of it that they're safe because of air gap, number one. which makes them even more vulnerable, if you will. But then more importantly, and once again, I've talked to quite a few people, and I'm sure there are exceptions, the forces are totally against that in terms of air gapping. Air gapping has two liabilities to it. Not the liabilities, but limitations, if you will. A lot of times, if you want to run the systems most efficiently, as we all know, you want to connect them together so you can be more efficient. And furthermore, more and more, particularly, I gave an interview recently about renewable energy. And renewable energy typically involves windmills out in God knows where, up some mountain someplace or other. Do you want to drive up in the middle of a snowstorm to the windmill to see how things are going? So more and more we connect to the internet so we can talk to them, monitor them remotely. So if anything, air gaps are diminishing in the world at large, not increasing.
Yeah, it's as we're trying to make things more efficient, more effective, it's introducing additional risk to the process.
Which doesn't mean that, I got to be clear about one thing I always stress to people. If you want to minimize your risk, don't get out of bed in the morning. Because you could slip in the shower. So obviously it's a balancing act. You got to decide, but the key thing is you don't want to do foolish risks, number one. And if you're going to have a risk, make sure you got some, a nice carpet on the floor in the bathroom. So when you fall down on something soft. So it doesn't mean that you can avoid all risks. But you definitely can minimize them, number one, of occurring, and number two, minimize how much damage can occur if the risk takes place. That's probably a healthy way to think about it.
Yeah, like you said, there's no way to eliminate all risk. And so the issue is to try to figure out, well, how much risk can you live with? And if something does go wrong, what do you do?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting because I think we understand that when it comes to driving your car is a perfect example. I think a perfect example of that. We know that there's inherent risk in driving a car, that no matter how good of a driver you are, there's other drivers on the road, there's wild animals that run across the road, and there's debris that pops tires. And then so we have insurance to address, or hopefully we have insurance, depending on what state you're in. You have insurance to deal with the other side of that in case something does happen, that there's coverage and protection.
But since you mentioned automobiles, let me mention something to you, a two-part story, if you will. About, 15, 20 years ago, I was a visiting professor at the University of Nice in France. By the way, Nice is really nice. And the group I was working with there happened to be affiliated with another group at the university that was doing automotive telemetrics. Now, this is 15, 20 years ago, so this was not autonomous vehicles, but they were looking at sensors in cars and maybe emissions control things and so on. And after talking to them for a while, I came to the following realization. They have lots of technical issues to deal with. They've got to find a way to make this equipment inexpensive, small, cheap, able to deal in a hostile roadway environment. They have a list of N things to worry about. Cybersecurity was somewhere down around N+1.
Yeah.
Okay. This was 15, 20 years ago. About 2 years ago, just before COVID, so maybe it's now closer to 3 years ago, I was on a trip to Singapore, visiting one of the research groups over there, designing and building autonomous vehicles. I had a conversation with them. 20 years later, the same basic conversation. They've got really major, serious technical problems to overcome. And once they've overcome all those, then they'll start thinking about cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And so all these new, great, wonderful things we have popping up all over the place. Now, I'm not saying there aren't exceptions. I'm sure there are companies that take it as a priority. I just haven't found one yet.
And I'm trying to think of the way to phrase this. I don't think that the entities are thinking cybersecurity isn't important. I think it's part of the mentality is, well, if we can't solve the physical engineering issues, then we're never going to even need to address the cybersecurity issues. So it's almost like a design process issue. Okay, we've figured out all the technical stuff and built it, and it physically works and physically does what it's supposed to do. Okay, now we can move on to cybersecurity. It's just, unfortunately, much further down the line.
Exactly. But one of the things, once again, this is an ongoing part of our research we're doing here now. Much like in software, nothing to do with cybersecurity, but in software, a lot of times designing safe software that works correctly, it's easier to do that in the early stage than try to retrofit it later on.
Mm-hmm.
And using the same kind of logic, a lot of times we believe if you design it with cybersecurity in mind, it's a lot easier than trying to bolt it on afterward. In fact, in some cases, it turns out it wasn't possible.
Yeah.
They actually realized that in order to make it secure, the product wouldn't work, and they had to start over again. And so, it's a major mindset change, and it's happening at glacial speed, unfortunately.
Well, is that part, like, I'm not going to blame educational institutions here necessarily. Is that part of, there is a shift, there has to be a shift in the way that people are educated that are working on these systems. And so inherently it's going to take 10, 20 years. It changes at the corporate level. People realize, oh gosh, we've got to change this, but that doesn't change how people are actually being taught in college.
I'm glad you brought that up. Because I just had we had a what can I call it? A video conference, a remote conference about a month ago. I'm not sure if you or your viewers are familiar with it. There's a thing called the Log4j vulnerability. So for those who don't know what it is, it's a piece of software that's widely used in hundreds of millions of computers that someone realized it has a vulnerability in it. A vulnerability that's often called a zero-click vulnerability. In other words, it doesn't require you clicking on a link from a Nigerian prince. Yeah. It doesn't require someone to know your password. Basically, your back door is wide open. They can walk right on in. It's a pretty serious vulnerability. What was interesting was that piece of software had gone through 8,000 quality assurance checks. Every release goes through 8,000 quality assurance checks. The trouble is, and this goes back to your education, we teach people how to design software to do what we intended to do.
Yeah.
We don't have them design software that may be misused in some way or another. And in fact, once again, I'm sure there's an exception out there, but in this group of 100 or so people, we say, does anybody know any university that teach you how to design software that resists these kinds of problems? It's not part of the software design process at any of the schools that we know of. Mm-hmm. So there's you almost have to flip your head around, not think about what the software is supposed to do, but what it could be made to do.
Yeah. Do you see schools starting to, lack of a better description, to start having hacking degrees? Well, I think like we teach, we like you're saying, you teach defensively. Hey, here's the things that you do to protect yourself. But are there institutions that are actually starting to teach people how to try to thwart existing technologies and break into them as a degree, so to speak?
Well, as you know, there's an increasing number of schools that offer degrees in cybersecurity, either bachelor level degrees or master degrees. I have not studied all of them. There's obviously it's growing as the interest level grows. And as you may know, I've heard reports of anywhere from 1 million to 2 million open job positions. So if you want to think of a career, that's not a bad place to go. But so what I'm about to say is not scientifically grounded. Mm-hmm. But what I've seen in studies we've done, mostly going back 2 or 3 years, so it's not recent, most people basically repackage things they've been teaching for decades and put the label cybersecurity on it.
Yeah.
And so whether they actually are adding anything that specifically is going to make it significantly better, not a lot. I won't say there's nobody out there because I haven't studied everyone.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, people are taking the easy way out.
Yeah.
Teach good software programming and hope that somehow that will solve the problem.
Yep. I definitely know the feeling. So I think this is actually a good place to wrap it up. And I think there's a little bit of like, oh gosh, this is a bit scary, but I think there's a bit of optimism in that, like, there are people like you and people trying to find out how do we do things better? How do we teach things better in a way that's going to prevent that will mitigate these issues. It might not be tomorrow, but as a course of action, they're going to get mitigated over time.
Well, the one thing I'll say at the end was I kind of alluded to earlier, and that's why I think what you're doing is so helpful, is I think the issue of thinking about how to change the way people think of the world, think of the kind of what I call cybersecurity culture in organizations, and whether it be in your organizations or in your home life. I have a lot of sayings I pass on to my students, but one of them is you can put a better lock on your front door, but if you're still putting the key under the front mat, are you any more secure?
Yeah.
And a lot of times we have to really think about what we're doing and why we're doing and how we're doing things. And I think the self-reflection is something that we need to all work on, both in our individual lives as well as in our corporate life, as well as in our government. The role, for example, it was only after the Colonial Pipeline situation, the cyber attack there, did the government require pipelines to report cyber attacks. They were not required to even report them before. So there's just a lot, none of this is rocket science.
Yeah.
But it requires you to start thinking about things in ways that we haven't done before. And that's the hope we have, is that we will get people thinking these ways, and that will start to turn the tide in our favor.
Yeah. So if people want to find you online, where can they find you?
Well, best thing to do, we have a website that has all our research center. It's cams.mit.edu. That's cybersecurity at MIT Sloan. And there they'll have a lot of the articles he wrote, a lot of the news articles we have to do as well, both the technical articles for people who want to go deep, but as well as the overview articles if people want something fun to read about or scary to read about, as the case may be.
Hopefully not too scary stuff, but we'll make sure to link those in the show notes. Stuart, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you found something interesting in this episode, please share a review at easypray.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Stuart Madnick can be found at easypray.com/116.